In 1885, a small Apache girl stood on the auction block in Tucson, Arizona Territory, her dark eyes scanning the crowd of white faces that looked at her with everything from pity to disgust. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the dusty marketplace as he called out prices like she was cattle or farm equipment. $2. That was all anyone was willing to pay for a human life. $2 for a child who had already survived more hardship than most adults would face in a lifetime. The girl's name was Ayanna, which meant eternal blossom in her native tongue, though none of the bidders cared to know that. To them, she was just another Apache, a reminder of the Indian problem that the government was trying to solve through forced assimilation and cultural destruction. Her long black hair had been roughly cut short, her traditional clothing replaced with a stained cotton dress that hung loose on her small frame. But behind those defiant eyes burned a spirit that no auction block could break. What nobody in that crowd could have imagined was that this unwanted, rejected child would one day become one of the most respected women in the Arizona Territory. They couldn't foresee that her life would intertwine with that of a quiet cowboy who saw something in her that others missed. They had no way of knowing that her story would challenge everything they believed about race, family, and what it meant to be human in the American West. This is the true story of how a $2 Apache girl and an unlikely cowboy changed each other's lives forever, proving that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the most unexpected places. The year was 1885, and the Arizona Territory was a harsh, unforgiving place where survival often meant abandoning one's humanity. In the Chiricahua Mountains of southeastern Arizona, a young Apache girl named Ayanna lived with her family in a world that was rapidly disappearing around them. The Apache people had roamed these lands for generations, living in harmony with the desert's rhythms, following the seasons and the game trails that their ancestors had walked for countless centuries. Ayanna's father, Nailnish, was a respected warrior and hunter who could track a deer for days across rocky terrain that would challenge even the most experienced white trackers. Her mother, Desba, was known throughout their band for her skill in weaving baskets so tightly they could hold water, and for her knowledge of desert plants that could heal wounds or fill empty bellies during lean times. They lived in a traditional wickiup made of oak poles and covered with bear grass, a home that could be dismantled and moved when the band needed to follow the buffalo or escape the ever-encroaching presence of white soldiers. Ayanna was 8 years old when her world began to crumble. She had learned to weave from her mother's patient hands, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, and to move silently through the desert like a shadow. Her father had begun teaching her to track animals, following their prints in the sand, and reading the stories they told about where the creatures had been and where they were going. She spoke fluent Apache, understood some Spanish from trading encounters, and had picked up a few words of English from the occasional peaceful contact with white settlers. The Apache way of life was built on respect for the natural world and strong family bonds. Children were treasured and educated in the skills they would need to survive in the desert environment. Ayanna learned that everything in nature had a purpose and a spirit that deserved respect. The eagle flying overhead, the cactus flower blooming after rare rainfall, the snake coiled beneath a rock, all were part of an interconnected web of life that the Apache understood intimately. But the world beyond their mountain strongholds was changing rapidly. The American Civil War had ended, and westward expansion was accelerating as settlers, miners, and ranchers poured into Apache territory. The discovery of silver and copper in the mountains brought prospectors who had no understanding of or respect for Apache land rights. Cattle ranchers established large operations that interfered with traditional hunting grounds and water sources that the Apache had used for generations. The United States government, determined to open the West for development, viewed the Apache as obstacles to progress. Military campaigns were launched to force all Apache bands onto reservations where they could be controlled and monitored. General George Crook led expeditions into the Chiricahua Mountains, using Apache scouts from rival bands to track down those who refused to surrender their freedom. The policy was clear: submit to reservation life or face annihilation. Ayana's band tried to avoid contact with the soldiers, moving deeper into the mountains and surviving on increasingly scarce resources. Game became harder to find as white hunters and settlers disrupted traditional migration patterns. Water sources that had sustained the Apache for generations were claimed by ranchers who built fences and posted guards to keep Indians away. The band was slowly being starved into submission. The breaking point came during the winter of 1884. A severe drought had made water extremely scarce, and the band was forced to venture closer to white settlements in search of reliable springs. Ayana's father and several other men went on a hunting expedition, hoping to find deer in the lower elevations where grass was more plentiful. They had been gone for 3 days when a cavalry patrol found the band's camp. The attack came at dawn, when a morning mist still clung to the mountain peaks. Ayana woke to the sound of gunfire and her mother's urgent voice telling her to run toward the rocks above their camp. The soldiers had surrounded the Wickiups, giving the Apache no chance to escape or even gather their belongings. Women grabbed their children and ran for cover, but the rocky terrain that usually provided protection now seemed to offer no safe haven. Ayana's mother pushed her into a crevice between 2 large boulders, whispering urgent instructions in Apache. She told her daughter to stay hidden until the shooting stopped, no matter what she heard. Desba pressed a small silver bracelet into Ayana's hand, a piece of jewelry that had been in her family for generations, and kissed her forehead one last time before running back toward the camp to help other women and children escape. From her hiding place, Ayana could hear the chaos of the attack. Soldiers shouted orders in English, while Apache women cried out in their native language, trying to keep their families together as they were rounded up. The smell of gunpowder drifted on the morning air, mixed with the smoke of burning Wickiups. The soldiers were destroying everything they couldn't carry, eliminating any possibility that the Apache could return to their former way of life. The battle lasted less than an hour, but to Ayana, it felt like an eternity. When the shooting finally stopped, she could hear soldiers moving through the camp, calling out to each other as they gathered their prisoners. She pressed herself deeper into the rock crevice, clutching the silver bracelet and trying to control her breathing so the soldiers wouldn't hear her if they passed nearby. Hours passed before she dared to move. The sun was high overhead when she finally crept out of her hiding place and looked down at what remained of her home. The Wickiups had been burned to the ground, leaving only blackened circles where her people had lived. Personal belongings were scattered across the campsite: broken pottery, torn clothing, children's toys made from corn husks and twigs. Everything that represented the life she had known was destroyed. Ayana called out softly for her mother, then louder when she received no response. She searched through the ruins of the camp, hoping to find someone from her band who might have escaped the soldiers' net. But the camp was empty except for a few scavenging ravens that had come to investigate the destruction. Her family, her entire world, was gone. For 3 days, the 8-year-old girl survived alone in the mountains, eating cactus fruits and drinking water from small pools trapped in rock formations. She had learned enough from her parents to find food and shelter, but she knew she couldn't survive indefinitely on her own. The desert that had once seemed like a protective embrace now felt vast and threatening. Every sound made her freeze with fear that soldiers were returning, or that wild animals might catch her scent. On the 4th day, hunger and loneliness drove her to approach a remote trading post that her father had sometimes visited to exchange deer hides for metal tools and blankets. The trader, a grizzled man named Bill Henderson, was initially suspicious of the lone Apache child who appeared at his door. But when she showed him the silver bracelet and tried to trade it for food, he realized she was probably a survivor from one of the recent cavalry raids. Henderson faced a difficult decision. He could try to reunite the girl with her people on the reservation, but he knew the conditions there were harsh, and that many Apache children were being sent away to government boarding schools designed to eliminate their cultural identity. He could try to care for her himself, but he was a bachelor living in isolation with no experience raising children, especially Apache children in a territory where anti-Indian sentiment ran high. The solution he chose reflected the brutal realities of the time. Henderson contacted the territorial authorities and reported that he had found an Apache orphan. The officials decided that the girl should be auctioned off as an indentured servant, a legal practice that allowed white families to purchase the labor of Indian children for a specific period of years. The arrangement was presented as humanitarian, giving orphaned Indian children homes and opportunities to learn civilized ways, but it was essentially a form of slavery disguised as charity. Ayanna didn't understand what was happening when Henderson loaded her into his wagon and drove to Tucson. She had never seen a town before, with its wooden buildings, bustling streets, and crowds of people. The noise and smells were overwhelming. Horses and mules cooking food, tobacco smoke, and the unwashed bodies of men who spent their lives working in the desert heat. She pressed herself against the side of the wagon, trying to make sense of this alien environment. The auction was held in the town square, a dusty open space surrounded by businesses and saloons. A wooden platform had been erected for the occasion, and chairs were arranged in rows for potential bidders. Signs posted around town had announced the sale of Apache girl, approximately 8 years old, suitable for household work and training in civilized ways. The language used was careful to frame the transaction as a benevolent act rather than human trafficking, but the reality was that a child was being sold to the highest bidder. When Henderson led Ayanna onto the platform, she could feel dozens of eyes examining her like she was livestock being evaluated for purchase. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man in a black suit, began describing her attributes in English that she couldn't fully understand. He mentioned her apparent good health, her young age that would allow for proper training, and her quiet demeanor that suggested she wouldn't cause trouble for her new owners. The bidding began slowly. A few ranchers' wives showed mild interest, thinking an Indian girl might be useful for cleaning and cooking. But when they looked at Ayanna more closely, they saw something that made them uncomfortable. Despite her ragged appearance and obvious fear, there was a dignity in her bearing that reminded them that she was human, not property. Her dark eyes met theirs steadily, without the submissive downward gaze they expected from someone in her position. One by one, the potential bidders found reasons to look elsewhere. Some whispered that Apache children were unpredictable and might turn violent when they got older. Others worried about what their neighbors would think if they brought an Indian child into their homes. A few were simply uncomfortable with the entire process, though none was willing to speak out against it publicly. The auctioneer's voice grew more urgent as the bidding stalled. He reduced the starting price from $5 to $3, then to $2 when even that amount failed to generate interest. The crowd began to disperse, people shaking their heads and murmuring that maybe this particular child was just too much trouble to be worth the investment. At that moment, a man who had been standing quietly at the back of the crowd stepped forward. He was tall and lean, with weathered hands and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years spent working outdoors. His clothes were clean, but worn, the practical garments of someone who valued function over fashion. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes, making it difficult for others to read his expression. The man raised his hand and called out in a clear voice, $2. The auctioneer looked relieved that someone was finally willing to bid and quickly called for any higher offers. When none came, he banged his gavel and declared the sale complete. The Apache girl belonged to Thomas McKenna, a cowboy whose own life story was about to become intertwined with hers in ways that neither of them could imagine. As Thomas approached the platform to claim his purchase, Ayanna studied his face, trying to understand what kind of fate awaited her. She had learned to read people quickly during her short life, and something in this man's quiet manner suggested he might be different from the others who had examined her with calculating eyes. But She was still just 8 years old, still traumatized by the loss of her family, and confused by the strange new world she had been thrust into. Thomas handed over the $2 and received a piece of paper that legally transferred ownership of the child to him. The transaction was completed with the same casual efficiency used to buy a horse or a sack of grain. No one asked Ayanna what she wanted or how she felt about being sold to a stranger. In the eyes of territorial law, she was property now, not a person with rights or feelings. As Thomas led her away from the auction platform toward a waiting horse, Ayanna clutched the silver bracelet her mother had given her, the last tangible connection to her former life. She didn't know that this moment marked the beginning of an extraordinary relationship that would challenge both of them to grow beyond the prejudices and limitations of their time. All she knew was that her world had changed completely once again, and she would have to find new ways to survive in circumstances she never could have imagined. Thomas McKenna lifted Ayanna onto his horse with the same gentle care he might use to handle an injured animal. She sat rigidly in front of him, every muscle tense with fear and uncertainty as they rode away from Tucson toward his ranch in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. The journey took most of the afternoon, following dusty trails that wound through mesquite and Palo Verde trees, past rocky outcroppings where lizards basked in the desert sun. Thomas had not planned to attend the auction that morning. He had come to town to purchase supplies and happened to be walking past the square when he heard the auctioneer's voice describing the Apache child. Something compelled him to stop and watch, though he couldn't have explained why. When he saw the little girl standing on that platform, her dignity intact despite her obvious terror, he felt a familiar ache in his chest that he had learned to carry silently for many years. The ranch where Thomas lived was modest by territorial standards. A small adobe house with thick walls that stayed cool in summer and warm during the cold desert winters, a barn for his horses and the few cattle he owned, and a well that provided reliable water even during dry spells. He had built most of it himself after arriving in Arizona Territory 5 years earlier, fleeing memories that had made his former life in Kansas unbearable. Thomas McKenna was a man shaped by loss. He had been married once, to a gentlewoman named Sarah, who shared his dream of building a life together on the frontier. They had settled near Abilene, where Thomas worked as a ranch foreman and Sarah taught school to the children of neighboring families. For 3 years, they had been happy in a way that made Thomas believe he was the luckiest man alive. Sarah had become pregnant with their first child, and they spent long evenings planning the future they would build together. But cholera had swept through their community during the summer of 1879, taking Sarah and their unborn child within a matter of days. Thomas had buried his wife and the dreams they had shared, then packed his few belongings and headed west, looking for a place where the memories couldn't follow him. He had chosen Arizona Territory partly because it was as different from Kansas as he could imagine, a harsh, demanding landscape that required all of his attention just to survive. For 5 years, Thomas had lived alone on his ranch, working his cattle and horses, growing enough vegetables to supplement his diet, and avoiding close relationships with his neighbors. He was known as a fair man who kept his word and minded his own business, but he had built walls around his heart that seemed impenetrable. He attended church occasionally and participated in community events when necessary, but he always went home alone to a house that echoed with silence. When he brought Ayanna to his ranch that evening, Thomas realized he had no clear plan for what to do with her. He had acted on instinct at the auction, responding to something he saw in her eyes that reminded him of his own pain. But now he faced the practical challenges of caring for a traumatized Apache child who spoke little English and had every reason to distrust white people. The first few days were difficult for both of them. Ayanna remained silent, eating the food Thomas prepared but refusing to meet his eyes or respond to his attempts at conversation. She slept on a pallet he made for her in the main room of the house, but he often heard her crying softly in the darkness. During the day, she would sit outside on the porch, staring toward the mountains where her people had lived, clutching the silver bracelet that was her only link to her lost family. Thomas understood her grief because he recognized it in himself. He had spent years trying to outrun his own sorrow, but seeing this child's pain forced him to confront emotions he had buried. He began to realize that maybe they could help each other heal if he could find a way to bridge the cultural and linguistic barriers between them. He started by trying to learn some words in Apache, using a guidebook he found in Tucson, and practicing pronunciation until he could say simple phrases like "good morning" and "are you hungry?" Ayana's surprise when he first spoke to her in her native language was the first crack in the wall of silence she had built around herself. She didn't respond immediately, but Thomas saw something shift in her expression that gave him hope. Thomas also began teaching Ayana practical skills she would need to survive in the white world, but he tried to do it without destroying her connection to her Apache heritage. He showed her how to cook foods that were common among white families, but he also encouraged her to share what she knew about desert plants and traditional cooking methods. He taught her to read and write English using a primer he had ordered from back east, but he also asked her to teach him Apache words and their meanings. The breakthrough came after she had been with him for 2 weeks. Thomas was working in his small vegetable garden, trying to save tomato plants from an invasion of hornworms, when he noticed Ayana watching him intently. She approached slowly and pointed to a plant growing wild near the garden fence, speaking a few words in Apache. When he looked confused, she pulled up the plant and showed him how to crush the leaves and mix them with water to create a natural insecticide. Thomas applied her remedy to his tomato plants, and within days the hornworms were gone. He realized that this quiet child possessed knowledge that could be valuable in ways that most white settlers never imagined. Her understanding of desert ecology and traditional Apache methods of living in harmony with the environment could teach him things that no book or neighbor could provide. From that day forward, their relationship began to evolve from owner and property to something more complex and meaningful. Thomas started asking for Ayana's advice about ranch problems, and she began sharing more of her traditional knowledge. She showed him how to identify edible desert plants that could supplement their diet during lean times, how to predict weather changes by observing animal behavior, and how to conserve water using techniques her people had developed over generations. Ayana also began to open up about her lost family, speaking of her parents and their life in the mountains with a mixture of love and grief that Thomas found deeply moving. She told him about Apache customs and beliefs, helping him understand that her people were not the savage warriors described in newspaper accounts, but complex human beings with rich cultural traditions and sophisticated knowledge of their environment. As autumn turned to winter, Thomas faced a difficult decision about Ayana's future. Arizona territorial law required that Indian children receive some form of formal education, and the nearest option was a government boarding school in Phoenix designed to strip Indian children of their cultural identity and remake them as civilized Americans. The school's motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man," and Thomas had heard enough stories about conditions there to know that sending Ayana would be tantamount to destroying everything that remained of her Apache identity. Instead, Thomas decided to educate her himself, using materials he ordered from Eastern publishers and supplementing formal lessons with practical training in ranch management and household skills. He taught her arithmetic using ranch accounts, geography by studying maps of the territory, and history through books that he selected carefully to include multiple perspectives on the conflicts between white settlers and Native Americans. Ayana proved to be an eager and intelligent student. She learned to read English with remarkable speed, often staying up late by lamplight to practice with books Thomas borrowed from neighbors or purchased during trips to town. She showed particular interest in stories about other cultures and faraway places, perhaps sensing that knowledge would be her key to navigating the complex world she now inhabited. But the most important lessons they taught each other had nothing to do with formal education. Thomas learned from Ayanna that healing from profound loss required more than simply enduring pain in isolation. Her resilience and capacity for hope in spite of everything she had suffered inspired him to begin opening his own heart again. He found himself looking forward to their conversations, planning activities they could share, and taking pleasure in small daily routines that had once felt empty and meaningless. Ayanna learned from Thomas that not all white people were her enemies, and that it was possible to adapt to a new culture without completely abandoning her Apache identity. His respect for her knowledge and traditions gave her confidence to share more of herself. While his patient teaching helped her develop skills she would need to succeed in a world that often seemed hostile to people like her. Their relationship was not without challenges. Neighbors whispered about the propriety of a single man raising an Apache girl, suggesting everything from inappropriate relationships to dangerous radical ideas about racial equality. Some questioned whether Thomas was contributing to the Indian problem by failing to properly civilize his ward, while others worried that Ayanna might influence him to develop sympathy for Apache raiding parties that still occasionally struck isolated ranches. Thomas also struggled with his own conflicted feelings about the role he was playing in Ayanna's life. He had purchased her at an auction like a piece of property, and the legal documents still referred to her as his indentured servant with specific obligations and restrictions. But he increasingly saw her as something closer to a daughter, a relationship that was complicated by the racial and cultural barriers that surrounded them. During the winter of 1885 to 1886, Thomas began to research legal options for changing Ayanna's status from indentured servant to adopted family member. He discovered that adoption of Indian children by white families was possible, but extremely rare, requiring documentation of the child's background and formal approval from territorial authorities who might not look favorably on such an arrangement. The process was further complicated by the fact that Ayanna's legal status was unclear. She had been classified as an orphan, but Thomas had no definitive proof that her parents were dead rather than simply imprisoned on a reservation somewhere in the territory. If her biological family was still alive, any adoption proceedings would become much more complex and controversial. As spring arrived and the desert bloomed with wildflowers, Thomas and Ayanna had settled into routines that felt almost like a normal family life. She helped with ranch chores that matched her size and strength, maintained a small garden where she grew traditional Apache foods alongside crops common to white households, and continued her studies with an enthusiasm that impressed everyone who met her. But they both knew that their peaceful existence existed in a bubble that could be burst at any time by outside forces beyond their control. Arizona Territory was still a volatile place where violence between whites and Apaches could erupt without warning, and their unusual living arrangement made them targets for suspicion from both communities. The test of their bond came sooner than either of them expected, in a way that would force them to choose between safety and principle, between conforming to social expectations and following their hearts. The choice they made would determine not just their own futures, but their understanding of what family really meant in a world that seemed determined to keep people separated by race, culture, and history. The crisis that would test everything Thomas and Ayanna had built together arrived on a blazing hot morning in June 1886. When a dust cloud on the horizon announced the approach of unwelcome visitors. Thomas was teaching Ayanna how to repair bridle leather when they spotted the riders, and something in their purposeful approach made him instinctively move closer to the girl who had become the center of his world. The delegation consisted of 3 men: Sheriff William Morton, a territorial official named Hamilton Pierce, and Dr. Marcus Whitman, who ran the Phoenix Indian School that had gained a reputation for its harsh methods of cultural assimilation. They rode into Thomas's yard with the confidence of men who were accustomed to having their authority unquestioned, dismounting from their horses and approaching the porch where Thomas and Ayanna waited. Sheriff Morton spoke first, his voice carrying the formal tone of someone delivering an official pronouncement. He explained that reports had reached territorial authorities about the unusual arrangement at Thomas's ranch, specifically concerning the Apache girl who should have been enrolled in proper educational institutions designed to prepare Indian children for productive lives in white society. Dr. Whitman had traveled from Phoenix specifically to evaluate Ayana's situation and determine whether she required immediate placement in his school. Thomas felt his heart racing, but he kept his voice steady as he invited the men to sit in the shade of his porch and offered them water from his well. He had founded the Phoenix Indian School with the sincere conviction that the best way to help Indian children was to completely remake them in the image of white American civilization. His methods were harsh, but, in his mind, necessary to save Indian children from what he saw as the primitive ignorance of their traditional cultures. As Dr. Whitman examined Ayana, asking her questions in English and observing her responses, Thomas could see the man forming judgments based on preconceived notions about what civilized behavior should look like. Ayana answered politely, but maintained the quiet dignity that had impressed Thomas from their first meeting. She demonstrated her ability to read and write English, showed her knowledge of arithmetic and geography, and described the household and ranch duties she performed as part of her daily routine. But Dr. Whitman was not satisfied with evidence of Ayana's educational progress. He was more concerned with what he saw as signs that she had not been properly separated from her Apache identity. He noticed that she still wore her hair in traditional braids rather than the short, severe style mandated at his school. He observed that she spoke to Thomas with a directness that he considered inappropriate for an Indian child addressing a white authority figure. Most troubling to him, he detected what he interpreted as excessive pride and self-possession, qualities that his experience told him needed to be broken down before proper reconstruction could begin. Thomas found himself defending not just his methods of educating Ayana, but his entire philosophy about what it meant to help someone adapt to a new culture without destroying their essential humanity. He argued that Ayana's knowledge of Apache traditions and her connection to her cultural heritage made her more valuable, not less, as a member of territorial society. Her understanding of desert ecology, her skills in traditional crafts, and her bilingual abilities were assets that could contribute to the growing territory's development. Dr. Whitman listened to Thomas's arguments with the patience of someone who had heard similar misguided sentiments from well-meaning whites who failed to understand the larger stakes involved in Indian policy. He explained that individual cases, however touching, could not be allowed to undermine systematic efforts to solve the Indian problem through comprehensive education and assimilation programs. Allowing exceptions would set dangerous precedents that could interfere with the government's broader goals for Indian populations. The territorial official, Hamilton Pierce, was more concerned with legal and political considerations than educational philosophy. He pointed out that Thomas's informal adoption of an Apache child could create complications for territorial authorities who were trying to maintain peaceful relationships with reservation populations while also satisfying white settlers who demanded security and protection from Indian raids. If other Apache families learned that their children could be placed in white homes rather than government schools, it might encourage resistance to official policies. As the conversation continued through the afternoon, Ayana remained silent, but alert, understanding enough of what was being discussed to realize that these men had the power to take her away from the first real home she had known since losing her family. Thomas could see the fear in her eyes, carefully hidden behind the stoic expression she had learned to wear when dealing with authority figures who might interpret any display of emotion as weakness or defiance. Thomas made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He looked directly at Dr. Whitman and stated clearly that he intended to legally adopt Ayana as his daughter, regardless of whatever obstacles the territorial government might place in his path. He had consulted with a lawyer in Tucson who had assured him that adoption was possible, though it would require extensive documentation and formal approval from multiple territorial officials. The announcement stunned all three visitors, but Dr. Whitman recovered quickly and launched into a detailed explanation of why such an arrangement would be disastrous for everyone involved. He argued that Thomas was being naive about the challenges of raising an Apache child in white society, particularly a girl who would face unique obstacles as she reached adulthood. He warned that Ayanna would never be fully accepted by white communities and that her mixed cultural identity would leave her belonging nowhere and fitting in nowhere. Dr. Whitman also raised practical concerns about Thomas's ability to provide proper guidance for a young Apache woman navigating the complex social expectations of territorial society. He questioned whether a bachelor cowboy could understand the specific challenges that an Indian girl would face as she matured, particularly regarding marriage prospects and social relationships that would be complicated by her racial background and unusual upbringing. Thomas listened to these arguments with growing frustration, recognizing the paternalistic assumptions that lay beneath Dr. Whitman's humanitarian rhetoric. The doctor genuinely believed he was helping Indian children, but his help required them to abandon everything that connected them to their families, their cultures, and their identities. Thomas had seen enough of Ayanna's strength and intelligence to know that she could navigate whatever challenges lay ahead if she had support and guidance rather than cultural destruction. The conversation reached a turning point when Dr. Whitman made the mistake of addressing Ayanna directly, speaking to her in the condescending tone he used with students at his school. He asked her whether she understood how fortunate she was to have this opportunity to receive proper education and training that would prepare her for a useful life. He explained that the Phoenix Indian School would teach her valuable skills like industrial sewing, cooking for large groups, and other domestic abilities that would make her employable as household help for white families. Ayanna's response surprised everyone present. In carefully measured English that demonstrated both her educational progress and her natural intelligence, she thanked Dr. Whitman for his concern, but explained that she was learning everything she needed to know from Thomas, who treated her like a family member rather than a servant in training. She described her studies, her responsibilities on the ranch, and her growing understanding of both Apache and white ways of life. She concluded by stating simply that she wanted to stay where she was, with the man who had given her a home when no one else wanted her. Dr. Whitman was clearly taken aback by Ayanna's articulate response and her obvious comfort in expressing her own opinions. In his experience, properly trained Indian children learned to defer to white authority figures and rarely spoke unless specifically asked to recite lessons they had memorized. Ayanna's self-possession and confidence were exactly the qualities his school was designed to eliminate, seeing them as evidence of dangerous pride that needed to be broken down. Sheriff Morton, who had remained largely silent during the philosophical debates, finally spoke up with practical concerns about the legal and social implications of Thomas's proposed adoption. He pointed out that territorial law was unclear about the rights of Indian children to choose their own living situations, and that there were no precedents for white adoption of Apache children that could guide official decision-making. He suggested that the safest course would be to follow established procedures that had been developed specifically to handle cases involving orphaned Indian children. Hamilton Pierce raised additional complications related to federal Indian policy and the delicate relationships between territorial authorities and various Apache bands that were still negotiating the terms of their confinement to reservations. He worried that allowing Ayanna to remain in an unofficial family situation might send the wrong message to Apache leaders who were already suspicious of white intentions regarding their children. As evening approached, the three officials prepared to spend the night in Tucson before returning to their respective offices to consider their options. Dr. Whitman made it clear that he considered Ayanna's continued residence with Thomas to be a temporary arrangement at best, and that he expected territorial authorities to eventually order her transfer to proper educational facilities. He warned Thomas that resistance to official policies could result in serious legal consequences and community backlash that might ultimately harm Ayanna more than it helped her. After the men departed, Thomas and Ayanna sat together on the porch as darkness settled over the desert. Neither of them spoke for a long time, both understanding that their peaceful life together was now under serious threat from forces they could not control. Ayanna finally broke the silence by asking Thomas what would happen if the officials decided to take her away from him. Thomas took her small hand in his weathered ones and made a promise that would guide all of his future actions. He told her that he would not let anyone take her away against her will, regardless of what it cost him personally. He explained that he had never had a daughter before she came into his life, but that she had taught him what it meant to be a father. He promised to fight for her right to choose her own future, even if it meant challenging the territorial government and the social expectations of their community. Ayanna responded by telling Thomas something she had never shared with anyone since the day her Apache family was taken from her. She explained that her mother had given her the silver bracelet not just as a memento, but as a symbol of hope that someday she would find a new family that would love and protect her the way her original family had. She had carried that hope through the auction block, through the early days of fear and silence, and through all the gradual steps that had brought them to this moment of connection and mutual care. Thomas realized that evening that his relationship with Ayanna had grown beyond anything he had expected when he impulsively bid $2 for her at the Tucson auction. She was no longer a traumatized Apache child he was trying to help. She was his daughter in every way that mattered, and he was prepared to sacrifice everything he owned to protect her right to remain with him. The battle for Ayanna's future was about to begin in earnest, and it would test both their courage and their commitment to each other in ways that neither of them could fully anticipate. But they would face whatever came next as a family, united by bonds that had grown stronger than the cultural and racial barriers that the outside world saw as insurmountable. The next phase of their story would require them to navigate complex legal challenges, overcome social prejudices that ran generations deep, and prove to skeptical officials that love and respect could bridge differences that most people considered permanent and unbridgeable. The stakes could not have been higher, not just Ayanna's individual future, but the broader question of whether different cultures could coexist and learn from each other in the rapidly changing American West. The legal battle for Ayanna's future began 3 weeks after Dr. Whitman's visit, when Sheriff Morton returned to Thomas's ranch with a formal notice from the territorial court. If he could convince Judge Blackwood that Ayanna was thriving in his care and that formal adoption would serve her best interests, he might succeed in making their family relationship legally permanent. But if the judge sided with Dr. Whitman's arguments about proper education and cultural assimilation, Ayanna could be removed from his custody immediately and sent to the Phoenix Indian School. The weeks leading up to the hearing were filled with intense preparation as Thomas consulted with lawyers, gathered documentation to support his case, and tried to prepare Ayanna for what would likely be an intimidating legal proceeding. He hired Samuel Patterson, one of Tucson's most respected attorneys, who had experience with territorial law and understood the complex issues surrounding Indian policy and children's rights. Patterson warned Thomas that their case would face significant obstacles because territorial authorities generally favored institutional solutions for Indian children rather than individual family arrangements. The government's policy of cultural assimilation was based on the belief that systematic education in controlled environments was more effective than informal integration into white households. Most territorial officials genuinely believed that removing Indian children from all cultural influences was the kindest and most effective way to prepare them for successful lives in white society. Thomas spent considerable time documenting Ayanna's educational progress, gathering examples of her written work, arithmetic problems she had solved, and maps she had drawn showing her understanding of territorial geography. He also collected testimonials from neighbors who could attest to her good character and the positive changes they had observed in her during the time she had lived with him. But Patterson advised Thomas that academic achievement alone would not be sufficient to win their case. They would need to demonstrate that Ayanna's overall development and well-being were better served by remaining in Thomas's custody than by being transferred to institutional care. This meant addressing Dr. Whitman's concerns about cultural identity, social integration, and long-term prospects for her successful adaptation to territorial society. Ayanna herself became an active participant in preparing for the hearing, working with Patterson to understand the legal process and practicing how to present herself and her views to Judge Blackwood. The lawyer was impressed by her intelligence and articulate manner of expressing herself, but he warned her that the judge might be less receptive to testimony from an Apache child than from white adults who claimed to know what was best for her. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late August, when the desert heat made Tucson feel like an oven, and even the courthouse's thick adobe walls provided little relief from the oppressive temperature. Thomas and Ayanna rode to town the evening before, staying at a small hotel where they tried to get enough sleep despite their anxiety about the next day's proceedings. Judge Harrison Blackwood was a veteran of territorial law who had presided over numerous cases involving conflicts between white settlers and various Indian tribes. He had a reputation for fairness within the constraints of existing territorial policies, but he was also known as a firm believer in the government's assimilation programs for Indian populations. His courtroom was typically filled with cases involving property disputes, cattle rustling, and occasional violent crimes, making Ayanna's custody hearing an unusual addition to his docket. The hearing began with Dr. Whitman presenting his arguments for why Ayanna should be transferred to the Phoenix Indian School. He spoke passionately about the humanitarian mission of his institution and the comprehensive educational program designed to prepare Indian children for productive lives in white society. He described the school's curriculum, which included academic subjects, vocational training, and intensive cultural instruction designed to replace tribal customs with civilized American values. Dr. Whitman presented statistics showing the success rates of students who had completed his program, emphasizing their employment rates and their successful integration into white communities throughout the territory. He argued that while Thomas McKenna might have good intentions, he lacked the systematic approach and specialized knowledge required to properly prepare an Apache girl for the challenges she would face as an adult in territorial society. The doctor also raised concerns about the social isolation that Ayanna would experience if she remained in an informal family arrangement that left her belonging neither to white nor Apache communities. He argued that the Phoenix Indian School provided peer relationships with other Indian children who were undergoing similar transitions, creating a supportive environment that could ease the psychological challenges of cultural adaptation. When Patterson cross-examined Dr. Whitman, he focused on the harsh disciplinary methods used at the Phoenix Indian School and the high rates of illness and death among students who were removed from their familiar environments and forced to adapt to institutional life. He presented documentation of student complaints about inadequate food, overcrowded dormitories, and punishments that included extended periods of solitary confinement for students who were caught speaking their native languages or practicing traditional customs. Dr. Whitman defended his methods as necessary components of a comprehensive transformation process, arguing that short-term discomfort was justified by long-term benefits for students who successfully completed the program. He acknowledged that some students struggled with the transition, but maintained that the alternative, allowing Indian children to remain in traditional environments, would condemn them to poverty and cultural isolation that would be far more damaging than temporary institutional challenges. Thomas testified about his relationship with Ayanna and the progress she had made during the 18 months she had lived with him. He described her academic achievements, her contributions to ranch operations, and her growing understanding of both Apache and white cultural traditions. He emphasized that she had maintained her connection to her Apache heritage while successfully adapting to white society, demonstrating that cultural integration was possible without complete cultural destruction. Thomas also addressed Dr. Whitman's concerns about social isolation by describing Ayanna's interactions with neighbors, her participation in community events, and the respect she had earned from adults who had initially been skeptical about his decision to bring an Apache child into his household. He argued that her success in these relationships proved that individual integration could be more effective than institutional assimilation in preparing Indian children for adult life in territorial society. The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when Judge Blackwood allowed Ayanna to testify on her own behalf. Patterson had prepared her carefully for this opportunity, but everyone in the courtroom was uncertain how an Apache girl would handle the pressure of speaking directly to a territorial judge about her own future. Ayanna approached the witness stand with the quiet dignity that had impressed Thomas from their first meeting. She wore a simple dress that Thomas had purchased for the occasion, but she also wore the silver bracelet her mother had given her, a visible reminder of her Apache heritage. As she took her seat and faced Judge Blackwood, there was absolute silence in the courtroom. Speaking in clear, measured English that demonstrated both her educational progress and her natural intelligence, Ayanna described her life before and after coming to live with Thomas. She spoke about losing her family and the fear and confusion she had experienced during her early days on his ranch. She explained how Thomas's patience and kindness had helped her begin to heal from the trauma of losing everything she had known and loved. But Ayanna's testimony went beyond simply praising Thomas's care and describing her academic progress. She spoke eloquently about the importance of maintaining connections to her Apache heritage while also learning to navigate white society. She described how Thomas had encouraged her to remember and share her traditional knowledge while also teaching her skills she needed to succeed in the territorial community. Most powerfully, Ayanna addressed Dr. Whitman's arguments about the benefits of institutional education by explaining that she had learned more valuable lessons about life from being treated as a family member than she ever could have learned from being processed through an institutional system. She spoke about the difference between being taught subjects and being taught to think, between memorizing rules and learning to make moral choices, between following orders and developing the confidence to express her own opinions. Judge Blackwood was visibly impressed by Ayanna's testimony, but he also recognized the broader implications of his decision for territorial Indian policy. If he allowed Thomas to formally adopt an Apache child, he would be setting a precedent that could encourage other white families to seek similar arrangements, potentially undermining the systematic approach that territorial and federal authorities had developed for dealing with Indian populations. After a brief recess, Judge Blackwood delivered his decision from the bench, acknowledging the complexity of the case and the valid concerns raised by both sides. He praised Dr. Whitman's dedication to Indian education and recognized the important role that institutions like the Phoenix Indian School played in territorial Indian policy. He also commended Thomas for his obvious care and concern for Ayanna's welfare, and acknowledged the remarkable progress she had made in his custody. However, Judge Blackwood ultimately ruled that Ayanna's best interests would be served by remaining with Thomas, subject to specific conditions designed to address the concerns raised by territorial authorities. He ordered that Ayanna must continue her formal education through certified teachers who would be hired to provide instruction that met territorial standards. He also required regular inspections by territorial officials to ensure that she was receiving proper care and making satisfactory progress toward full integration into white society. Most importantly, Judge Blackwood ruled that Thomas could proceed with formal adoption proceedings, but only after a 1-year probationary period during which Ayanna's situation will be monitored closely by territorial authorities. If she continued to thrive and demonstrate successful cultural adaptation, the adoption would be approved. If problems arose, she would be transferred to institutional care, as Dr. Whitman had recommended. The decision represented a partial victory for Thomas and Ayanna, but it also placed them under continuing scrutiny that would test their relationship in new ways. They had won the right to remain together as a family, but they would have to prove repeatedly that their unconventional arrangement was successful according to standards set by officials who remained skeptical about the wisdom of individual solutions to broader policy challenges. As they left the courthouse together, Thomas and Ayanna understood that they had crossed an important threshold in their relationship, but they also knew that their struggle for acceptance and legal recognition was far from over. The year ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities that would test their commitment to each other and their shared vision of what family could mean across cultural and racial boundaries. The legal victory was just the beginning of a longer journey toward full acceptance and integration that would require them to continue demonstrating that love, respect, and mutual understanding could overcome the prejudices and systematic barriers that the territorial society had constructed to keep different cultures separated. Their success would depend not just on their own efforts, but on their ability to gradually change the minds and hearts of neighbors and officials who had never imagined that an Apache girl and a white cowboy could create a genuine family relationship that enriched both of their lives. The year that followed Judge Blackwood's ruling proved to be the most challenging and transformative period in both Thomas and Ayanna's lives. The court-mandated probationary period meant that their every action was scrutinized by territorial officials who were looking for any sign that their unconventional family arrangement was failing to meet the standards expected for the proper raising of an Apache child in white society. The first challenge came with finding a certified teacher who would be willing to provide formal instruction to an Apache girl living on a remote ranch. Most educated women in the territory preferred teaching positions in established towns where they could board with respectable families and participate in organized social activities. The prospect of traveling to an isolated ranch to tutor an Indian child was not appealing to teachers who were already struggling to maintain their social standing in communities that viewed their profession with mixed respect and suspicion. Thomas finally found Miss Elizabeth Harper, a young woman from Ohio who had come to Arizona Territory after completing her education at Oberlin College, one of the few institutions in the country that admitted both women and African Americans. Miss Harper had been teaching in a small school near Phoenix when she learned about Thomas's unusual situation through a network of educators who were following Ayanna's case with interest. Elizabeth Harper was an idealist who believed deeply in the power of education to transform individual lives and create social progress. She had been frustrated by the limitations placed on her teaching by conservative school boards that wanted her to focus on basic literacy and domestic skills rather than challenging her students with literature, science, and critical thinking. The opportunity to design a comprehensive educational program for an intelligent Apache girl appealed to her sense of adventure and her commitment to educational innovation. When Miss Harper arrived at the ranch in September 1886, she found Ayanna to be far more advanced academically than she had expected based on reports from territorial officials. Thomas's informal instruction had given Ayanna a solid foundation in reading, writing, and arithmetic, but more importantly, it had nurtured her natural curiosity and love of learning that made her an eager student ready to tackle more challenging subjects. Miss Harper designed an ambitious curriculum that went far beyond the basic domestic training that Dr. Whitman had recommended for Apache girls. She introduced Ayanna to literature by authors like Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, and Louisa May Alcott, encouraging her to think critically about the social issues these writers addressed in their novels. She taught advanced mathematics, including geometry and basic algebra, explaining that these subjects would develop logical thinking skills that could be applied to any field of study. Most controversially, Ms. Harper included lessons in natural sciences, geography, and history that challenged some of the prevailing assumptions about racial and cultural superiority that dominated territorial education. She taught Ayanna about different civilizations around the world, emphasizing that every culture had developed unique knowledge and achievements that contributed to human progress. She encouraged Ayanna to research and write about Apache history and traditions, treating them as legitimate subjects for academic study rather than primitive customs that needed to be forgotten. Thomas initially worried that Miss Harper's progressive educational methods might create problems with the territorial officials who were monitoring Ayanna's progress. But he quickly realized that the teacher's approach was helping Ayanna develop intellectual confidence and critical thinking skills that would serve her well throughout her life. Miss Harper was teaching her not just to memorize facts, but to question, analyze, and form her own opinions based on evidence and reasoning. The relationship between Thomas, Ayanna, and Miss Harper evolved into something resembling an extended family, with the teacher boarding at the ranch during the week and returning to town on weekends. Miss Harper brought books, newspapers, and magazines that connected them to intellectual developments in the broader world beyond Arizona territory. She organized evening discussions where all three of them could explore ideas and debate issues that interested them. These conversations had a profound impact on Thomas, who had received only basic formal education, but possessed natural intelligence and curiosity that had been neglected during his years of grieving and isolation. Miss Harper encouraged him to read more broadly and think more deeply about the social and political issues that affected their community. Ayana's questions about history, science, and literature challenged him to examine his own assumptions and expand his understanding of the world. Ayana flourished under Miss Harper's instruction, demonstrating academic abilities that impressed even skeptical territorial officials who conducted their required inspections. She wrote essays that showed sophisticated understanding of complex literary themes, solved mathematical problems that challenged students in much larger schools, and displayed knowledge of geography and history that exceeded what most white children learned in territorial classrooms. But the most significant developments during the probationary year had to do with Ayana's growing sense of identity and confidence as she learned to navigate the complex world of territorial society while maintaining her connection to her Apache heritage. Miss Harper had encouraged her to view her bicultural background as an advantage rather than a source of confusion, teaching her that people who understood multiple cultures could serve as bridges between communities that might otherwise remain isolated and suspicious of each other. Ayana began writing letters to territorial newspapers, sharing her perspectives on issues related to Indian policy and cultural understanding. Her essays were written with such intelligence and eloquence that editors initially assumed they had been composed by Miss Harper or Thomas rather than by an Apache teenager. When they realized that Ayana was indeed the author, her writing began attracting attention from readers throughout the territory who had never encountered such thoughtful commentary from an Indian perspective. The attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Some readers were impressed by Ayana's obvious intelligence and education, seeing her as proof that individual Indians could successfully adapt to white society if given proper instruction and support. Others were troubled by her confident expression of opinions and her refusal to adopt the submissive attitude that they expected from Indians who had been civilized through white education. During the spring of 1887, Ayana received an invitation that would test everything she had learned about navigating territorial society. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, the wife of a prominent Tucson businessman, invited her to speak at a ladies' literary society meeting about her experiences as an Apache child being raised in a white household. The invitation was both an honor and a potential trap, offering Ayana an opportunity to influence influential white women while also exposing her to scrutiny that could be used against her if she made any mistakes. Thomas and Miss Harper spent weeks helping Ayana prepare for this speaking engagement, understanding that her performance could significantly influence public opinion about her case and potentially affect other Apache children who might seek similar arrangements in the future. They practiced her presentation repeatedly, helping her anticipate difficult questions and prepare thoughtful responses that would demonstrate her intelligence and cultural sensitivity. The speaking engagement took place on a warm May evening in Mrs. Morrison's elegant parlor, filled with the wives and daughters of Tucson's most influential families. Ayana arrived wearing a beautiful dress that Miss Harper had helped her select, along with a silver bracelet that connected her to her Apache heritage. She was nervous but determined to represent herself and her people with dignity and intelligence. Ayana's presentation exceeded everyone's expectations, including her own. She spoke eloquently about her journey from the Chiricahua Mountains to Thomas's ranch, describing the loss of her original family and the gradual development of new family relationships based on mutual respect and love rather than legal obligation or cultural dominance. She explained how her Apache heritage had enriched her understanding of the natural world and provided her with values that complemented rather than conflicted with the education she had received from Thomas and Miss Harper. Most powerfully, Ayanna challenged her audience to reconsider their assumptions about Apache people and Indian education policy. She described the complex knowledge and sophisticated social organization that characterized traditional Apache society, helping her listeners understand that her people were not primitive savages who needed to be completely remade, but rather human beings with their own valuable traditions that could contribute to territorial development if they were treated with respect rather than hostility. The questions from the audience were sometimes challenging and occasionally hostile, but Ayanna handled them with grace and intelligence that impressed even skeptical listeners. When one woman suggested that her success was exceptional and that most Apache children would benefit from the systematic approach used at institutions like the Phoenix Indian School, Ayanna responded that her experience suggested that individual attention and cultural respect might be more effective than mass processing in preparing Indian children for successful lives in territorial society. The Literary Society meeting became a turning point in public perception of Ayanna's case and the broader questions it raised about Indian education and cultural integration. Several influential women who attended the meeting became advocates for her adoption and began pressuring their husbands to support more flexible approaches to Indian policy that would allow for individual solutions rather than exclusively institutional ones. Word of Ayanna's successful presentation reached Judge Blackwood and other territorial officials who were responsible for deciding whether to approve Thomas's adoption petition. The positive response from Tucson's social elite provided strong evidence that Ayanna had successfully adapted to white society while maintaining her personal dignity and cultural integrity. As the probationary year drew to a close in the summer of 1887, Thomas began preparing the formal adoption petition that would make Ayanna legally his daughter rather than his ward. The process required extensive documentation of her progress, character references from prominent community members, and formal statements from territorial officials who had monitored her situation throughout the probationary period. The final hearing took place on a crisp October morning when the desert heat had finally broken and the first hints of autumn made outdoor work pleasant again. Judge Blackwood's courtroom was filled with supporters who had come to witness what many hoped would be a historic decision that could influence future cases involving Indian children and white families. Dr. Whitman was present to offer his final objections to the adoption, but his arguments lacked the conviction they had carried 2 years earlier. Even he was forced to acknowledge that Ayanna had thrived under Thomas's care and had achieved educational and social success that exceeded what most students accomplished at his Phoenix Indian School. His opposition was reduced to abstract concerns about policy precedents rather than specific criticisms of Ayanna's development or Thomas's parenting. Judge Blackwood's decision was swift and decisive. He praised Thomas for his dedication to Ayanna's welfare and commended Miss Harper for providing educational instruction that had prepared Ayanna for full participation in territorial society. Most importantly, he recognized Ayanna herself for demonstrating that successful cultural integration was possible without complete cultural destruction. The adoption was approved, making Ayanna McKenna the legal daughter of Thomas McKenna and one of the first Apache children to be formally adopted by a white family in Arizona Territory. The decision established a legal precedent that would influence future cases and provide hope for other Indian children who found themselves caught between cultures in the rapidly changing American West. As they left the courthouse for the final time, Thomas and Ayanna understood that they had accomplished something far more significant than resolving a single custody case. They had proven that families could be created across racial and cultural boundaries, that education could respect rather than destroy cultural heritage, and that individual relationships based on love and mutual respect could overcome the systematic prejudices that divided territorial society. Ayanna McKenna would go on to become one of the most influential women in Arizona history, serving as a bridge between Apache and white communities, and advocating for policies that promoted cultural understanding rather than cultural destruction. Her success inspired other Apache families to seek educational opportunities for their children while maintaining their cultural connections, and her example influenced territorial officials to develop more flexible approaches to Indian education and social integration. Thomas McKenna found in fatherhood a purpose and joy that had been missing from his life since losing his first family in Kansas. Ayana's presence had healed wounds he thought would never mend, and taught him that love could create families that were stronger than those formed by blood alone. Together, they had proven that the American West could be a place where different cultures learn from each other rather than simply competing for dominance. Their story became a testament to the power of human connection to overcome seemingly insurmountable barriers, and a reminder that progress often depends on individuals who are willing to challenge unjust systems and fight for the principle that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their cultural background or the circumstances that brought them into our lives.